Hi, everyone, and welcome to the final lecture of the semester. What I like doing for this last lecture is this is actually what the presentation I gave during my teaching demonstration during the interview portion of my kind of leading up to me getting hired into this program. Now, what I did for this was bring together my background in communication, my knowledge in leadership studies, as well as my background in community engagement. And I wanted to create a lecture that would bring in the idea with the central focus being how to create and maintain a synergistic team, right? A team that works together, because that's essentially what your job is as a leader. But a lot of that focuses in on, or kind of depends on, your abilities to communicate with your team and to get along with your team. And so I brought in some ideas. I've honed this lecture down. This is now the lecture I give when I give my leadership workshops at various presentations when UTEP asks me to. So I like saving this for the last lecture of the semester. Let's go ahead and get started. So I like starting with this GIF because it's highlights the idea of teamwork making the dream work. But let's go ahead and get started. So typically when you're thinking about the different parts of an organization or the different, potential team members or employees that you would have, I've essentially thought about the fact that there are typically three different types of team members. We have foundational, plateau, and temporary. Now, we can start from the bottom. So temporary is pretty self-explanatory, right? It's someone that might be there just for a short amount of time, essentially like a temp, could be an intern. It could be someone that's just there because someone's on maternity or paternity leave and this person's just filling in for a short amount of time. But those are your temporary team members. It could be someone who's a seasonal hire. Then we have our plateau team members. Now, these team members are folks who are going to get as high in the organization that they can. But once they reach a certain level and realize that there's nowhere else for them to go because someone's above them, or it just doesn't seem like there's going to be any other positions opening up, once they figure out what that plateau is, then they're gone, right? They're going to try to find another organization that they can join that can better suit their needs and their skills and their abilities and what they think they deserve. So those are your plateau team members. And then the last group are foundational team members. These are the folks that essentially love what they do and where they do it, and they've gotten comfortable with where they're at, and they have no intention of going anywhere, right? Typically, these are folks that have invested a lot into the organization, but it also could be some folks who are like, look, I have a very comfortable position. I have a 401k, I have a pension, I have retirement, whatever it is, it's keeping them there. But they've been there for 10 plus years and they're not going anywhere, right? It could be Robert in the mailroom. It could be Martha up in accounting. It could be any number of people, but those are typically also the people where, like, your first day at a new job, someone will say, hey, you definitely want to talk to Martha about some of the secrets of this place because she'll make your life a whole lot easier. Or you definitely don't want to rub Robert the wrong way because he knows enough people to make your life miserable. Like those type of people, right? Like they know all the ins and out of the organization and they're going to be there for a while. But all of these different team members make up your team, right? They're all people that you need to rely on in some capacity. Now, typically, when we think about organizational structures, we don't think about it in these terms of this foundational, plateau, and temporary. We think about it something like this, right? Where the boss is on the top making all the decisions and all the crap just kind of runs down. But the whole focus of this lecture is to start thinking about that in a little bit different way, right? I want you to think about this like this, right? Not a pyramid scheme. I know that's what it says on the lecture. But if you've ever done one of these, I think like Tough Mudder, any of these organized events where you're challenging either by yourself or you could be doing it with a team, the central focus here is working together to get to the end, right? Here, if you look at this picture, there's probably people here that don't know each other, right? But they're helping people get to the top with the kind of unspoken agreement that once you get up there, you're going to reach down and help me get to where you are too because I helped you. Right, that's essentially what we're trying to get at when we're building a team, right? Is building people that are going to help each other without any other added benefit than we're doing the right thing for the benefit of the group. Now, in terms of what your responsibilities are, before you start thinking about what are the strategies or what are the things I want you to think about, I think it's really important that you think about all that's going on just with your responsibilities or your identity as a leader, as the boss, right? So you're at the center of this graph here, right? But you think about all these other things that are going on, right? Like you have to provide guidance for your team. You have to oversee your team. You're also responsible for the results of that team. Those are all kind of intermingled and all rely on one another. Outside of that, in that gray circle there, you have your own responsibilities, right? Because when you get hired on for this job, you're not solely responsible for just what you're doing, or sorry, rephrase that. You're not solely responsible for just overseeing people, right? You're going to have your own responsibilities and objectives that you have to get done. So you're having to try to manage your team, guide your team, worry about those results, worry about your own responsibilities, and then on the very outside of all of that, you still have to make sure you're not necessarily abiding by, but that you're operating within that organizational culture. Especially if you're someone that's brand new, like you're jumping into a new organization, and your responsibility once you get there is trying to figure out what are the similarities and differences from your previous organization's culture to now your current one. And not just that, but more importantly, like what new organizational culture do you want to establish, and how are you going to do that via your communication? And I should note here, so a lot of what in addition to my own background, I also brought in a lot of Kim Scott and her book, Radical Candor. I'll have the book and a picture of Kim later on in the lecture in case you all are interested. It's a really great read, and I think it's really something you could benefit from if you are in a leadership position. You're really trying to focus in on your leadership communication. Next, we have with maintaining your team. I came up with an acronym at the very beginning of this, when I was putting this all together. At first it was Bear Down, but I figured if I ever get to a point where I want to copyright this thing, the Chicago Bears might make this a little bit difficult for me. So rephrased a few things, and now it's called A New Road. And we're going to go over these individually here. But we have act decisively, normalize communication, show empathy, weather the storms together, respond appropriately, own mistakes, be authentic, and develop consistently. Now, first we want to act decisively, right? So make the necessary decisions and show confidence, right? It's going to resonate with your team. It's going to motivate them, but you also want to make sure you keep your other viewpoints in mind. And I use Marie Kondo. If you're not familiar with her, she has a series on Netflix. And a lot of what she does is trying to simplify what you have going on in your life. And at times when you need to make a decision and let something go, you should also show appreciation for it and then let it go. But I think more than anything why I chose her is because oftentimes leaders get in a position where they get comfortable. They don't want to make any drastic changes because they don't want to rock the boat. But you start getting your team members in a position where they get comfortable too, right? They just get kind of bored. Potentially they might get in a position where they just they might not find that same fire that they had when they got hired, right? And I know a lot of folks say, well, that's not the focus. That shouldn't be like, you got hired to do a job, so just do your job. And that's fine, and that's going to be great for some people, right? But part of being a good leader and being a good communicator is understanding that not everybody is going to want to be led in the same way, right? So some people are going to want that decisiveness. They're going to want some excitement in some way, right? And you showing confidence in your decisions and what you're doing, that goes a long way in motivating your team members and keeping them enthused throughout the process, right? If you think about what we talked about in the Dennings book, right, where some people start kind of getting kind of lulled by like inaction, right? Especially when you're new to an organization, you're trying to get them to buy in. You're always going to have some folks that are going to just kind of dig their heels in no matter what because you're brand new. But making necessary decisions and showing that confidence can go a long way in getting that buy-in from even whether it's people that are kind of dug their heels in or whether it's people that are already gung-ho about it. Like that decisiveness can really help push them along. Normalize communication, right? And this goes beyond just saying that you're good at communicating, because more often than not, if you ask people what is the biggest issue with their organization, most people are going to mention communication, that there's bad communication. The problem with that is not enough people are defining exactly what bad communication is. What you should be doing more than anything is not focusing on whether bad or good communication is happening, but really first prioritizing that you have this importance on communication, that you're normalizing it, right? It's one thing, like the example I like using is there are a lot of professors who say they have like an open door policy, but the way they carry themselves in class lets their students know, hey, you definitely don't want any business of walking into my office. And there's a lot of people in corporate America who do the exact same thing, right? They publicly talk about how they want people to feel comfortable just walking into their office and mentioning whatever issues they may be having. But on a day-to-day basis, don't let their personality contrast that or conflicts with that idea. And so what you should be doing in a leadership position is building up this idea of how much you value communication, right? If you think about the articles we read in week 2, where they talked about motivating your employees, money only goes so far, right? But a lot of excitement and a lot of innovation happens when socialization happens, when people are focused on that communication. Now, what will this potentially lead to if you're normalizing communication? It'll lead to listening and seeking to understand versus telling people what to do. It has more to do with debating than with directing, more to do with pushing people to decide than being the decider, more to do with persuading than with giving orders, and more to do with learning than with knowing. And as a leader, that's one thing I tell every one of my students when they ask me my advice in terms of what I think are some of the more important aspects about being a leader, and it's always making sure you're trying to learn. One thing I always tell my students is that despite whatever degrees I may have, I am always going to be dumber than the sum of my class, right? I decided that in this whole wealth of knowledge, right? If you think about knowledge as a circle, I found this one little point and I just went as far as I could go with it, right? So I really know communication and I know leadership studies. But outside of that, I know my entire wealth of knowledge is nothing compared to the students in my class. And I'm always wanting to make sure that I'm learning from my students as much as they're learning from me. And I think in a leadership position, that's everything, right? You're trying to learn about your team and learn what works. That way you can figure out the best place where people might, excel at what they're doing based on the personality that they have and the communication skills that they have. And the only way you're going to be doing that is by normalizing communication. Show empathy, right? So that's essentially what the whole focus for Kim Scott in her book Radical Candor is, right? So how to be a great boss without losing your humanity. And it's all about making sure you're keeping your team members' lives and identities in mind, right? People don't want to think that they're just a number. And I know it's kind of a cliche thing to say, but it really comes down to people feeling that they're valued as part of an organization, right? And this means go beyond the golden rule, right? We all know the golden rule, treat others the way that you want to be treated. But that might not always be the case for some people, right? What if I'm the type of person that the way I need to be taught or I need to be led is tell me I'm a jerk who screwed up and I'm going to fix it? That might work for me, but that's definitely not going to work for everybody. So I'm not going to go ahead and treat everybody else the way that I want to be treated. As a leader, what I should be doing is getting to know my team and trying to figure out the best way to approach them and lead them and show empathy with them. And Kim Scott has this great quote where she talks about how you should be caring personally for your team, but challenging them directly, right? Understanding that you can care about your team members, but that doesn't mean you have to necessarily baby them in everything that they're doing. You should still be challenging them and showing that you have the confidence that they're going to succeed in their position and whatever objective you give them. Now, in terms of showing empathy, I think it also means as a leader, you need to understand the personal experience of your team, the team's experience, and provide that support and empathy. And I like taking that time to figure out the fact that, or to talk about the fact that in a leader, or as a leader, for you to get to the position that you're in, there's a lot of obstacles and hoops you've had to go through, right? We understand that. Everybody's lives have ups and downs, but the thing a lot of leaders don't take that extra step in figuring out is understanding what their team has potentially gone through, right? Not as a team, but individually to get where they are. Right. And I like giving some examples because I think I've been guilty of this myself. So a long time ago when I was writing one of my papers during my doctoral program, I was talking about identity and what it means to be a Latinx, graduate student. And one of my mentors at the time who was helping me with this paper asked me, were you going to talk about your sexuality in your paper? And I said, no, that's not something I ever have to I wasn't going to consider that or write about it. It's not something I ever really have to think about. It just so happens that mentor is gay. And he stopped me and he said, that's not something you ever have to think about, but I have to think about it all the time. A few years ago, I wasn't able to marry whoever I wanted, right? That's something that I had to consider, but you didn't have to think about that. And it really wasn't until that moment that I realized that was a slight extra burden that throughout my entire life I never had to worry about, right? It doesn't mean that my life didn't have its difficulties. It just meant that my sexuality was never something that made it more difficult. Similarly, later on, I remember talking about some colleagues, and it was one of those situations where, before every school year, you have to go through, all these kind of new employee situations. You have to go through workshops and all that. And they were talking about, workplace harassment, and a number of these things. And I remember getting into a conversation with some of my colleagues, and the question was asked at some point was, who here ever had a friend or family member pull them aside and give them some advice on strategies that they can do or go through to prevent themselves from being sexually assaulted in public at night or like in the parking lot or something? It was only women that raised their hands. And it hit me that was something that, again, never had to think about. And it led into a larger discussion where someone mentioned that there was like a Twitter poll going around. It was when, during this Me Too movement, someone put out a poll like, if all men had a 9:00 curfew, what are some major things that women would do? How would that change their lives? The majority of women said that they would go for a nighttime walk, right? I've never had outside of like some sketchy parts of El Paso, I've never had to really worry about what I was doing or where I was going at night if I was by myself. And again, it wasn't anything that I did to like necessarily get that. It just so happens that I was born male, and there are certain things that I just do not have to worry about. Doesn't mean my life wasn't hard. Doesn't mean that there were some things that really made getting my PhD and becoming a professor. It didn't mean it was always easy peasy for me. It just meant that me being a male, there were some things I just didn't have to think about. Similarly, there are some people in this country, in this world, that because of the color of their skin are going to be treated differently in ways that I, even as someone who identifies as Latinx or Latino or whatever you want other people identify themselves as, I never have to think about, right? Especially living in El Paso where it's a majority Latinx community. There are some things that I've never had to worry about that some of my colleagues who are Black or some of my colleagues who are Asian have absolutely had to worry about. And so I say all that because I think as a leader, I think it's important for us to recognize these things, right? And it's the phrase I like using is that I know that if you get into a leadership position, you had to work your butt off, right? No one's taking that away from anybody. And again, it doesn't mean that you didn't have to go through some shit to get there. But it potentially also might mean that there's some people on your team who had to work twice as hard to get to the middle. And I think it's something that you should recognize as a leader and understand and take the time to consider the other identities in your team. So let's move on. Weather the storm together, right? Obstacles are going to come. Some of these are going to be, individual. Some of these are going to be as a team. But you should always try to find a way to come together in the face of difficulties, right? You want to support your team members during their personal storms. And this goes back to the empathy thing, right? So if you have a team member who's dealing with a family issue, they're dealing with a health issue, you definitely want to show your support. But one thing that goes a little bit extra is touch base with them, right? Like if you found out that one of your team members, their sister, their husband, or their wife, or their kids was sick, right? With something more than just like the common cold or something. Touch back a few weeks later, like, how's your son doing? How's your daughter doing? Right? How are you feeling, right? Is there anything I can do to help, right? Within your capacity as a leader. But going back shows that extra step that you weren't just like, okay, yeah, if you need to take some time off, that's great. Which is also, a great thing to do as a leader. But it shows you care just a little bit more, right? Where the people they aren't just a number to you. Respond appropriately. I like talking about this because it's still really part of this idea of radical candor, right? So if you need to critique someone, critique them. At the same time, if someone did really well, I think it's important that you let them know that, right? And that goes hand in hand with this idea like of guiding folks, right? Your job as a leader is to guide people, right? If someone isn't doing their job well, you need to make sure that you're sitting back and understanding, did I give them everything they need in terms of direction to do well? Right? And think about that. If I just told you all, I need you to write a 10-page paper that's due at the end of the semester, but I didn't give you a subject line or a subject you need to focus on or a theory you need to focus on or even any parameters what format, any of these things. I just said, give me 10 pages of writing. I would get a lot of different types of papers by the end of the semester, right? And it wouldn't be fair to me for them to fail some folks and give other folks A's without giving people the proper guidance, right? And for some reason, like, we all understand that when it comes to academia, but once we get into the workforce, people are like, just do what I'm telling you to do without any type of direction, right? And I think oftentimes leaders get, because they're busy, right? Like, as a leader, you have a lot of things you have to think about. Oftentimes we forget that there are people that need a little bit more guidance than others. That's, again, knowing your team and figuring out what they need to succeed or to excel. Say thank you, right? People want to feel valued and they want to feel appreciated. And sometimes the little bit that people need to feel appreciated in their organization is just to hear the words thank you. And lastly, again, remember to care personally and challenge people directly. You don't need to baby people. You can let them know that you care, but still challenge them and let them know that you believe that they are capable of what you have asked them to do. Own the mistakes, right? There's going to, same way that there's obstacles, there's going to be mistakes, right? There's going to be your own mistakes. I think it's important that leaders acknowledge when they make a mistake, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It shows a little bit of vulnerability, which can be good in the workplace. You don't want too much vulnerability, but just a little bit allows people to know that they can maybe relax their shoulders a little bit where they're in this workplace, where they also might be able to take some chances, because if they fail, it could still lead to some type of innovation. Own your team's mistakes, but here's a little bit of advice when it comes to your team's mistakes. Own your individual mistakes privately, right? There's no benefit in critiquing someone or helping them along and simultaneously potentially humiliating them in front of the team, right? If you can potentially give or help with individual mistakes privately, that'll go a long way in, again, showing that you care. Own the team mistakes publicly, right? If the whole group didn't meet a deadline or didn't meet a goal, talk about, create that space, again, normalizing communication, and try to figure out a way where, okay, if we didn't meet this goal, what are some things that we can do that you saw along the way that we can do to improve next time? And lastly, find teachable moments and harness their potential, right? So let's say there is an individual mistake that you potentially think like, hey, other people might make the same mistake. What you can do then is talk about them publicly without necessarily singling someone out. Say, look, someone made a mistake and they did X, Y, and Z. I completely understand why that happened because of A, B, and C. So if you find yourself in this position, here's the way we need you to handle it, or here's the way that I want you to handle it. And if you have any questions, please email me, come to my office, whatever it is, I'm here to help, right? You want to find those teachable moments with your team. Be authentic. I'm not a Patriots fan, but I use this because this is Bill Belichick, coach for the New England Patriots, the NFL team. And he is arguably, depending on who you ask, probably one of the, if not the greatest coach of all time. Now, one thing that's very much known about Bill Belichick is that he's authentic, right? He is who he is. A lot of reporters don't like him because he doesn't really give a lot of answers. He's kind of taught his team to be the same way. They really don't give a lot of information about the team and what they're doing. Now, because he's been so successful, there's this trend in the NFL where it's like, well, if this guy's successful, I bet you a lot of the people that have helped him, his assistant coaches, will be just as successful. And that really hasn't been the case until recently. And typically it's because some of these coaches leave New England and go to their new job and try to be exactly like Bill Belichick, and that's not going to work, right? Myself, I have some mentors that I've had along the way who I've probably picked a few things from them that I thought, okay, I really like this aspect about their teaching style, but I'm not that person. So I can't just take their identity and try to teach the way that they did, right? I have to bring my own persona into the classroom and into what I'm doing, and you should be doing the same, right? You want to be your true self and lead in a way that makes sense with your own personality. Easiest example is when you have that friend who thinks they're hilarious, but everyone's just giving them courtesy laughs because they're not necessarily the most humorous person in the world, but they see that personality and want to be that way, right? They're not being their true, authentic self. And lastly, you want to develop consistently. My background, while it's in communication, I also looked at sports communication, and so a lot of my work was in football. This guy is Antonio Gates. And I'll get to him in a minute. So let's just focus on developing consistently. So we need to focus on your direct reports, right? So these are the people that are directly under you. You don't necessarily want to neglect the rest of your team, but the reason why I say you want to focus on your direct reports for this main reason, right? So the relationships may not scale, but the culture does. And what I mean by that is, as a leader, you're setting up your organizational culture, right? But depending on how large your organization is, it might be really difficult for you to kind of create relationships with everyone. That should be your goal, but sometimes, depending, especially in a really large organization, it might not even be feasible. Or logistically possible. But so while those relationships may not scale, right? You can't get the relationship you have with your direct reports and build that up with all the people that are underneath them. The culture can, right? If you're establishing that culture and developing consistently with your direct reports, that will start echoing into the rest of the organization. Now, another way that you develop consistently is on an individual basis, right? Develop the innate talent on your team. And that's where we get to Antonio Gates, who was a tight end for the San Diego Chargers. He went through all of college only playing basketball. But when he finished college, excuse me, some of the scouts basically said, look, you're kind of in between. You're not going to be great at ending up in the NBA. And so he went out and tried out for the Chargers. Now, if I remember correctly, Antonio Gates is about 6'5", 240 pounds. You can't coach someone up to be that tall and have that frame and have that size and athleticism. And so they got this guy who played basketball and figured, hey, I think we can make this work. And he became one of the most successful tight ends in NFL history, right? He has a lot of records with the Chargers. Excuse me. So you should be trying to do something similar, right? Like, in getting to know your team, you might figure out that someone who's in your accounting department loves doing graphic design. And what do you know? You just so happen to have a lot of graphic design needs. And so maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks, you get that person in accounting and say, hey, look, we know this is your main job, but every other Friday, we need you to come in with the advertising department and help with some of the graphic stuff, right? You might have solved your own problem and given them just one more reason why they love working where they work. But you're only going to know that if you've done some of the things we've talked about, right? Empathize with your team, communicate with your team, try to find different ways of going beyond the golden rule, right? So these are just some of the ways that I think you can build a good team, communicate well with your team, and be a good leader. You have to know that as a leader, you're going to have to adapt some of these things. Some of these things are going to be a little bit easier than others. And you might be in a situation where some of these things might not work at all. The only way you're going to know that is by getting to know your team. So I hope this was helpful. I want to thank you all for a great semester. Good luck to you all on your final papers. And it has been a pleasure having you in class.